For decades, the relationship between NATO and Russia has been a cornerstone of global security. But it's a story packed with tension, with mistrust, and with two sides looking at the world in fundamentally different ways. To really get what's going on, we have to push past the headlines and ask one single, really important question.
And that's the big puzzle here, right? NATO insists its entire purpose is collective defense, a shield for its members. But for Moscow, that exact same shield looks like a sword pointed right at them. How is it possible for two major powers to look at the very same thing and see completely opposite realities? Well, that's exactly what we're going to break down. The whole conflict really comes down to this paradox. It's a fundamental clash of viewpoints that has shaped European security for more than 30 years now. And this chart just lays it all out perfectly. From the Western point of view, expanding NATO after the Cold War was all about growing a community of democracies, basically creating a bigger zone of stability. But from Russia's perspective, they saw an aggressive military bloc, an alliance created specifically to oppose them, marching steadily right up to their borders. So you've got the same actions, but totally different interpretations. So which one is it? Well, the answer is, it's kind of both. And a theory from way back in the 1970s shows us exactly why. Okay, so this brings us to the key concept for understanding this whole dynamic. It's called the security dilemma. Think of it as this invisible force that keeps driving this vicious cycle of mistrust. Political scientist Robert Jervis put it like this, but put really simply, one country's defense is another country's offense. Let's say you build up your military to feel safe. Well, your neighbor sees all your new tanks and planes, they get nervous, and so they build up their military in response. So now you're both less safe than when you started, and the tension is way higher. It's a classic trap. To make this crystal clear, Jervis used a great analogy called the stag hunt. So imagine you're one of these hunters. The biggest prize, the absolute best outcome, is the stag. It's big enough to feed everybody. But here's the catch. To get it, everyone has to work together perfectly. Then, suddenly, a rabbit hops by. Now, it's a much smaller meal, for sure, but you can catch it all by yourself right now. You don't have to trust anybody else to do their part. So, what do, right? Do you trust your fellow hunters to cooperate and go for the big prize, the stag? Or do you defect, chase that rabbit, and guarantee a small meal just for yourself, even though it ruins the bigger goal for everyone else? That, right there, is the security dilemma in a nutshell. It's that constant tension between collective security, the stag, and your own self-interest, the rabbit. All right, so let's take this theory and plug it into the real world. We're going to jump to the 1990s and see exactly how this whole thing played out right after the Soviet Union collapsed. So after the Warsaw Pact just dissolved in 1991, you had this huge security vacuum in Eastern Europe. NATO's answer was to slowly, gradually expand eastward. First, they did it through these cooperative groups, and then they launched something called the Partnership for Peace, which everyone basically saw as a kind of kindergarten for getting into NATO. For NATO, every single step was a defensive move, an attempt to build stability. And you can really see NATO's logic when you look at what it took to join. It wasn't just about having a big army, it was about values. To get in, you had to be a stable democracy, have a market economy, and have civilians in charge of your military. In NATO's mind, they were hunting the stag, building a bigger, safer, more cooperative community of democracies. But Russia saw a rabbit. Or maybe they saw NATO chasing its own rabbit, its own self-interest. They didn't see a community of values getting bigger. They saw a military machine, the very one created to contain them, creeping closer and closer. And this quote from 1997 really nails their core fear: military hardware, maybe even nuclear weapons, right on their doorstep. So NATO's defensive move was seen as an offensive threat. The security dilemma was in full dangerous swing. Now, to understand why their perceptions are so radically different, we have to look past their actions for a second and dig into their core identities, how each side sees itself and its proper role in the world. So here's the absolutely crucial point. NATO and Russia are operating on completely different software. NATO's identity is that of a community of values. Its actions are all about spreading democratic norms to create security. Russia, on the other hand, holds on to its historical identity as what's known in Russia as державность, which basically means great powerness. Its logic is pure realpolitik, all about practical power, not ideals, where your security comes from controlling a sphere of influence around you. And these clashing identities, that's the fuel that makes this particular security dilemma so intense. And you can hear this worldview loud and clear in this quote from President Bill Clinton back in 1995. You see, it's not about grabbing territory. For them, it's about enlarging the circle of common purpose. From that perspective, adding new members isn't an act of aggression at all. It's an act of inclusion, based on principles you all share.
But Russia's identity? It's been forged through centuries of invasion and struggle, and a deep-seated belief that it has to be a major pole in the global system. And that means protecting its near abroad, all those former Soviet republics, as a vital buffer zone. So when NATO expands into that zone, Russia doesn't see a circle of common purpose. It sees a rival power encroaching on its most vital security interests. So, when you put these two things together, the security dilemma and these fundamentally clashing identities, you end up in a situation that is incredibly dangerous and just really, really hard to get out of. So, okay, just how dangerous are we talking here? Well, Robert Jervis, the same political scientist, actually created a framework to diagnose how severe any security dilemma is. He broke it down into 4 possible worlds. Now, I know this looks a little complex, but it's really just asking 2 simple questions. First, looking at the columns, in this situation, is it easier to attack or to defend? And second, looking at the rows, can you actually tell the difference between your neighbor's offensive weapons and their defensive weapons? And the most dangerous combination, right there in the top left, is World 1, a world where it's easier to attack, and you can't even tell if your neighbor is preparing for offense or defense. And that is exactly where the NATO-Russia relationship lives. It's doubly dangerous. And why is that? Because NATO's defensive expansion is completely indistinguishable from an offensive encirclement to Russia. And in this kind of environment, both sides feel like they have to act first just to stay safe, which makes any crisis way more likely to escalate into a real conflict. Each side's attempt to feel safer makes the other feel profoundly more threatened. So that leaves us with the ultimate question. See, this isn't really a story about good guys and bad guys. It's about a structural trap. If NATO is just acting according to its identity as a community of values, and Russia is just acting according to its identity as a great power, and both of those actions are seen as direct threats by the other, how can that cycle ever be broken? Is real, genuine cooperation even possible when both sides are prisoners of their own logic?
Subscribe now for more conflict breakdowns.